Now the June ADP has been posted on the DLF website. We're back with 2 more pairings of players to highlight undervalued players compared to more premium players despite similar age, situations, and production. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to show you stats from 2 similar players, but one of them is valued at a premium in startup drafts or trades, and the other is valued as the generic version of that same player. Then we're going to break it all down. So first up, we have a wide receiver comparison, and premium receiver is going to be 27 years old at the start of the 2022 NFL season. And over his last 17 games, he's produced 131 targets, 77 receptions, 1,053 yards, 5 touchdowns, has averaged 12.6 fantasy points per game, and has 4 top 24 weeks, with actually all of those being top 12. Our generic receiver is a little over 24 and a half years old, turning 25 at the end of October. And over his last 17 games, he's produced 140 targets, 81 receptions, 1,055 yards, 4 touchdowns, averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game, and has totaled 8 top 24 weeks, with 4 of those being top 12. To further feed the comparison, both wide receivers played for NFC teams last year that were sub 500, but they weren't bottom 5, so not horrible. Both are the wide receiver ones and the top targets on their teams, and both of their teams drafted a player from my Nittany Lions in the top 50 overall of the 2022 draft. Can you tell that I ran out of things to compare the 2 receivers directly for? So if you haven't guessed it yet, our premium player is Terry McLaurin, currently valued as the wide receiver 21 in June ADP, going in the 4th round of 1 QB startups. The generic receiver is Darnell Mooney, currently valued as the wide receiver 32 in the 6th round of 1 quarterback startups. So why the discrepancy between the 2? Well, to be honest, I don't really know. I think McLaurin's value is residual from the 3rd-year breakout hype that he had going into last season, where he didn't deliver on breaking out, but he didn't do horrible enough that we don't like him, kind of like what happened with DJ Moore a couple years ago. But even then, I don't understand how McLaurin still has wide receiver 21 value when that has been basically the best production he's ever returned in his 3-year career. Looking at just a few receivers behind him in ADP, I would take Mike Evans over him because I at least know that there's wide receiver 1 upside there, if not top 5 upside for how many games that Godwin's going to miss this year. Same goes for Keenan Allen, who will produce more right now. I would also take the upside shots on Jameson Williams and Jerry Jeudy, both at much younger ages. And I would take Hollywood Brown over McLaurin too because of ceiling and upside. McLaurin to me is just insanely overvalued right now for the mediocre production that he's given us so far in his career, which doesn't seem likely to change with Carson Wentz or in the future should he stay in Washington. His only redeeming quality is the impending free agency after the 2022 season, where he could go to a better situation. But now we're talking about a wide receiver on a new team where he might not even be the wide receiver 1, seeing the targets that he is right now in Washington. Not to mention, he's going to be 28 years old to start the season next year in 2023, which is the current age of Amari Cooper, going almost a round later than him right now, and that's with a much better production history. I honestly just don't get it with Terry McLaurin at all, and I would absolutely love flipping him for, basically any receiver behind him plus a little something, but specifically Darnell Mooney, because he's just the same player, just cheaper, younger, and with a better quarterback. I'll put the numbers up on the screen again to compare the 2 because they literally produced almost identical numbers in 2021, separated by only 4 receptions, 1 touchdown, and 6 fantasy points. That's it. Yet again, McLaurin is valued almost 2 rounds above Mooney for literally the exact same production and is 2 years older. Why? Maybe it's because we still see Mooney as the lower level prospect receiver coming out of college, drafted in the 5th round of the 2020 draft. Maybe it's because he plays for the Chicago Bears, had an okay rookie season 2 years ago. I honestly don't really know what it is, but Darnell Mooney is the for sure wide receiver 1 on his team, set to repeat what he did last year, if not honestly improve. He had 140 targets last year, and based on the Bears receiving core and roster, I don't know how he doesn't repeat that in 2022. Hopefully also with a new offense and a coaching staff, Justin Fields can take a step forward, and that should mean better things for Mooney. Now, I'm not saying that Mooney is going to launch to the moon, no pun intended, but over 1,000 yards and a handful of touchdowns is going to put him inside the top 25 receivers again. and that's not very different than what McLaurin will give you, just at a much cheaper price. Next, we have our first tight end comparison of this series. So premium tight end number 1 turns 25 in about 2 weeks at the beginning of July here. And over the last 2 seasons, he's averaged per game 6.5 targets, 4.5 receptions, 46.5 receiving yards, 0.35 receiving touchdowns, 11.4 fantasy points per game, and has totaled 15 top 12 weeks and 9 top 5 weeks over the last 2 seasons. Our generic tight end turns 26 in about a couple of weeks as well at the beginning of July. And over the last 2 seasons, he has also averaged per game 5.9 targets, 4.3 receptions, 43.1 yards, 0.36 receiving touchdowns, 10.8 fantasy points per game, and has also totaled 16 top 12 weeks, 8 of which were top 5. And to further feed the comparison, both of these tight ends play for NFC teams whose cities start with the same letter, and that's it. I'm sorry, I really don't have anything else to compare these 2 tight ends besides production. So if you haven't guessed it yet, our premium tight end is TJ Hawkinson, currently valued as the tight end 5 in June ADP at the 5-6 turn in 1 quarterback startups. The generic player is Dalton Schultz, currently valued as tight end 8 in the 8th round of 1 quarterback startups. So why the discrepancy here? And this one is honestly pretty similar to the McLaurin-Darnell Mooney comparison, where we have a premium player that we expected to break out, didn't, but again, didn't produce poorly enough to warrant dropping them in value, especially at the tight end position, where it's really, really hard to find good players. The other player is a lower drafted, less hyped, kind of came out of nowhere guy who has better production more recently, but because of his profile, we either don't trust the production or we don't trust the player to continue that production. Listen, I love TJ Hawkinson. I was all aboard his hype train last year, and even though he finished as the tight end 15 on the season because he missed 5 games, he was the tight end 7 in points per game, right there with Darren Waller, and a 1.5 better per game than Kyle Pitts. My only problem with TJ Hawkinson is really that he's the first player in the second tier of tight ends after the big 4 in Dynasty ADP and rankings. Clearly, I don't see a difference between him and Dalton Schultz, but I also don't really see a difference between him and Dallas Goedert, or him and Dawson Knox, or even really him and what I think Cole Kmet and Albert O can do if things go right for them. And all those guys are going significantly behind Hawkinson in startups. The other issue, I guess, which may or may not be an issue to be determined, are these significant adds to the receiver room in Detroit. The Lions traded up for Jameson Williams. They also signed DJ Chark in free agency, while also still having Amon-Ra and DeAndre Swift to compete for targets. You can make the argument that these options mean less defensive coverage dedicated to TJ Hawkinson, but it also means less overall targets to TJ Hawkinson too. This may or may not really hurt him for fantasy based on what he's already been doing for us, but I do think what this does is it lowers his ceiling to where he will never be that next level tight end that a lot of us wanted him to be. He can still be an every week starter for you at the position. He just won't really be that real difference maker at the tight end. Moving over to Dalton Schultz, I love the price point on Dalton Schultz right now, both in Dynasty and redraft actually. He's a top 5 tight end that's not priced as a top 5 tight end. He was a tight end 3 last year in total points, the tight end 5 in points per game. He's catching passes from a great quarterback in a great offense that also just lost a huge chunk of targets from Amari Cooper being traded. He doesn't have the injury concerns that George Kittle has. He doesn't have the new alpha target concerns that Darren Waller has. And he's not only what we want Dallas Goedert to be, he's also a year and a half younger than Dallas Goedert. And Dalton Schultz is priced behind all of those guys in ADP. Schultz has that unique ability to not only be a touchdown scorer, as he scored 8 touchdowns last year, but also a PPR guy because he had 7 games with 6 or more receptions last year. He's a set it and forget it player at the one position in fantasy that everybody is dying to get a set it and forget it player. There's a realistic chance that Schultz could see over 110 targets this year, which could, I think, easily translate to 1,000 yards and or double-digit touchdowns, and none of those milestones are off the table in 2022. And again, you're paying tight end 9 prices for him in Dynasty. So go out and buy yourself some Dalton Schultz, and if you're looking for some more reasons to buy Darnell Mooney, just go watch this video from Justin about Darnell Mooney, or you can click down here and watch why I love Courtland Sutton for 2022 and beyond.